La diffusion vient de démarrer. Tous les participants sont en mode écoute seul.
Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to greet you and to welcome you to this webinar on business planning for protected areas. This webinar is an NBSAP Forum webinar, and as you may know, the NBSAP Forum is a platform managed by the United Nations Development Programme, UN Environment, and the Convention on Biological Diversity. My name is Marion Marigot. I'm the UNDP Technical Specialist for the 6 National Reports to the CBD project, and I will be facilitating this webinar today. We are grateful for your participation in this webinar, and I want to warmly welcome and thank my colleague Andrew Rylance, who will be our speaker today. During this webinar, we will discuss what is a protected area business plan and show a few resources that may help you, all accessible on the NBSAP Forum. So back to Andrew. Dr. Andrew Rylance is a consultant specializing in environmental economics and conservation finance. He is technical advisor to the government of Seychelles UNDP GEF project on protected area finance. He's on a vetted expert roster of the Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services Network, the BESNet, and a member of the IUCN Specialist Group on Tourism and Protected Areas. He is Research Fellow of the University of Johannesburg and has a PhD from the College of Business and Economics at the same institution. Welcome, Andrew, and thank you for your time. So before we begin, I want to share with you a few rules and dynamics for this webinar. Your microphones will be muted during the presentation as it reduces interferences and facilitates communication. The session will last an hour. After a presentation from Andrew, we'll open the floor for your questions and remarks. If you think of a question while the presentation is in progress, you can use the control panel and write it. When the Q&A session comes, I will read your question to our speaker and he can answer it. And if you want to speak and the connection allows it, we will open your microphone during the Q&A session. And to let us know that you'd like to speak, you can simply raise your hand by clicking on the hand button on the control panel. This session is recorded, and we will upload the recording on the NBSAP Forum YouTube channel. We will also share the presentations on the NBSAP Forum and via email. So for information, the presentation today is given in English. However, I'm a native French speaker, and my colleague Diego is a native Spanish speaker. So as such, we're happy to take questions in the 3 languages, and we will translate them if necessary. And similarly, we can translate Andrew's response in English to French and to Spanish if needed. En français, pour information, la présentation du webinaire d'aujourd'hui est donnée en anglais. Cependant, je suis donc francophone et mon collègue Diego, lui, est hispanophone. Nous pouvons donc prendre vos questions en anglais, en espagnol et en français, et nous les traduirons si nécessaire. Et de même, on peut traduire les réponses de Andrew de l'anglais vers le français et l'espagnol si nécessaire. Y en español, para información, la presentación del webinar de hoy será en inglés. Sin embargo, soy francófona y mi colega Diego habla español. Por lo tanto, podemos responder sus preguntas en inglés, español y francés y las traduciremos si es necesario. Y de manera similar, podemos traducir las respuestas de Andrew del inglés a francés y al español si es necesario. So now, back to English, I will transfer the floor to Andrew. So Andrew, all yours.
Thank you very, very much, Marion. Very impressive. Okay, well, thank you very much to the NBSAP Forum for allowing me to present for this webinar, but also for hosting the business plan resources, which I'll go into a little bit more. So I've got 20 minutes to present. Just trying to change my slide. Sorry, Marion, my slides don't seem to be changing.
It's coming. Perfect.
Areas, and hopefully you can assume you've registered for this. I shouldn't have to try too hard to convince you. Second is to go into the components of business plans, and third, which is really the meat of this presentation, is to try and present the business plan resources, and hopefully they're useful for you going forward. seems to be a bit of a delay on my side on the slides.
We do sometimes have a bit of delays, so if you want to start speaking over the next slide, then it will probably come on time.
Do you want me to maybe try and check out of this slide share and then start again? Would that be easier?
Sure.
Okay.
Oh, there you go. We can actually see the next slide, so it's okay.
Their goals under the Aichi targets. We're seeing coverage of both marine and terrestrial over the last 10 years. The number and volume of PAs has been growing exponentially. The financing has not matched the expansion. What we're seeing is that the total available funding for protected areas has remained relatively stagnant in real terms. And low levels of biodiversity low levels of financing for biodiversity has remained a universal concern, and we're seeing it more and more often. Increased restriction on financing available for protected areas, there is a need to innovate. One of the studies from Bavanik et al. Highlighted that especially for Latin American countries, PAs are generally more dependent upon government budget support. And from additional study in 2016, is that, again, from Latin America, predominantly these areas are either financed by government budgets or through international cooperation from grants from donors and trust funds. So whilst there are specific areas, there are specific protected areas which should remain government budget supported because they are maybe too sensitive to have additional financing or use in those areas. Protected areas are generally becoming forced to become more innovative and look for more options for generating revenue. And we're seeing this increasingly as there's a number of new initiatives which are coming online to try and address these issues. Organizations like the UNDP Biodiversity Finance Initiative, the Blue Action Fund for marine protected areas, as well as new initiatives like the Coalition for Private Investment and Conservation, which tries to look at private investment into protected area management. So what is the status of business planning at the moment? Unfortunately, it's not entirely clear, and the studies are sporadic, but one of the largest ones that we've found is from 2012, which looks at 135 marine protected areas and identified that only 49% actually had a plan. So this may be, so still a large proportion of protected areas don't have a business plan or a financing plan. And this is sometimes a function that traditionally PA managers and government departments don't necessarily have this business background, but increasingly PAs are recognizing the importance of financially planning their future. And it's not an end result, but it is a step in the process of ensuring that there is effective management in marine protected areas globally. What is a business plan? In its simplest form, it's effectively a strategic way to plan and communicate the financial future for your PA or for your organization. It allows you to determine how much financial resources are required in order to achieve your long-term conservation targets, which is your objective, and then plot the most effective way in order to achieve that future. And as the figure on the right-hand side shows, sometimes it can feel like a bit of a minefield, knowing where to start, what to start with, who to be involved, what resources are available, what steps to take, and also a bit of learning about what are the obstacles that you're bound to encounter on the way. And sometimes this has created an obstacle to even beginning the process. And so hopefully this webinar and the resources contribute towards addressing some of these challenges. And one of the first things I get asked when talking about business planning from PA managers, but also CEOs is, why do we need one? What would we use it to justify? And that's the most important question. It could, depending on your circumstance, If you're, for example, a government protected area association, you could use a business plan to justify for increased budget support, rather than just say, for example, a increase by the cost of inflation. But actually, you can argue for a much greater budget if you can show how that money is going to be used effectively. Other protected areas have used it as a way to calculate what their contribution is towards productive sectors. So showing how that, justifying the existence of that protected area for how it contributes towards economic sectors such as tourism, fisheries, and water utilities, and wider livelihood impacts. And that can be quite an effective tool. It can increasingly, protected areas are being used to, business plans have been used, by protected areas to attract impact investment from private impact firms that are interested in investing in protected areas where they would accept a lower level of return for these additional environmental and social benefits. And this is a particularly interesting and growing area of the protected area finance field. If you're, another one would be if you're a new protected area, or you're trying to justify for the creation of a protected area, or even expanding an existing one, you can make that justification for, if the expansion of the creation, that you can manage that area and generate resources to not become an additional burden on centralized resources. You can also use it to identify and rectify areas of inefficiency, which is actually really important, and is often an underutilized area of business plans, where it's easier for you to identify cost savings and cost efficiencies before you start looking at generating additional revenue options. The last two are if you want to try and test and develop new business ideas. You want to try and grow your organization out of its existing options, and this gives you a way to create a vision for the future. And finally, the last one, that from the most basic approach, if you want to use a way to actually involve your staff more in the financial future of the organization. Often management will be left trying to determine what is the best financial options for the organization, when actually PA staff on the ground may have really great ideas which are much more practical and can be implemented. So this is a way of also building the PA managers and the PA staff into a bit more of the function of the whole organization and its future. A question I got asked before this webinar was, what affects whether a plan is actually successfully used? So you might develop it, but how do you know that it's actually going to be of use? And there's a few anecdotal options which I've come around on the past. And the first one is there a genuine demand for the plan from either a CEO or a board, or is it just being developed as part of a project, so it's sort of being forced upon the Protected Area Authority? If there's actually a genuine need from the CEO and the board, it's much more likely that they will drive the results. The second is often if there's a threat to existing funding, and it creates that need for action immediately. So there is greater emphasis on trying to develop the results in order to keep that organization moving. The third is often if there are existing business skills in the organization. If you've got a few staff members that have management or accounting experience, they're more like, those people are more likely to also become the champions of your business plan, and there would be great resources to help develop the plan with. Fourth, that all PA managers are not just involved in the process, but they see the benefits of it. And so what I mean by that is, we talk a lot about consultation, which is right, but actually developing a plan where the PA managers can get behind it. They see an added value to their daily operations. An example I can give from Seychelles, from a plan we made with the National Parks Authority, is their greatest frustration for them was the amount of time they spend collecting revenue. So the plan identified an option to try and create online payment systems, which would significantly reduce the time the managers spent collecting revenue. They can spend more time doing what they intended to do, which is conservation. And that was a particular draw card for them getting behind and pushing the plan. And finally, that a staff member is trained in the process. and actually it becomes part of their job function to implement the plan. So not that the plan is developed and then goes into the organization hoping to find a home, but somebody high up in the organization is tasked with actually implementing that plan, and the success of the plan is directly linked to their performance, annual performance plan, for example. So then how can a plan be used? And I want to try and draw upon some of the resources which you'll find in the on the NBSAP forum now. And I want to try and show how it's been used in different ways by different organizations. So one example is developed by Laughing Bird Key, return on investment for every dollar spent. So it managed to demonstrate what is not just the direct impact of spending in the marine park, but also what's the indirect impact for livelihoods and expenditure in the local town, in the nearest town, which was the departure point to access the marine protected area. And so that, by they could say, is for every dollar you put into the conservation in the park, we generate X number of dollars for the local community. And that can be a really important tool. Would you develop a business plan at? And that is a difficult question. It entirely depends upon the circumstance. What you'll find in the resource catalog are that some plans are developed for the specific protected area, some are developed for an institutional level, maybe called a strategic plan, and some are developed on a national level, which might be a national financing strategy. Depending on what the particular objective is for that organization and that area, will help you determine what the level of the plan that you can develop. The components of a business plan, again, there's no fixed formula. It entirely depends on what you really want to achieve with it, and that's really important. Having a specific objective that you want to achieve can also help determine the success of actually implementing it. Second is the level of financing required. The bigger your financing gap, the more elaborate your finance options and how elaborate the plan will need to be. 3, depending on the current development of financing options, will determine the range of options which you still need to develop, or whether the portfolio of options is relatively narrow if you've already done a lot. And fourthly, and quite importantly, is the experience of the PA team. If you want your business plan to be successful, it has to be written in a way that it can be communicated back to your PA team, but also to your wider stakeholder base. So trying to be overly complicated in your business plan has not necessarily, or trying to be very clever and very complex might look good on paper, but may affect the implementation of that plan. So simplicity is often key. Now, I don't want to go into all the process and the individual components one by one. That's already been done in another webinar, which was shared by by NOAA on their webinar series, and there's a link here if you want to access that. And I think that's an hour long, and that goes into individually breaking components that you see here. And what we've tried to do is outline what are the most common components of a business plan, which would act as your structure to work through. And now what I would like to do is I'd like to go through a few of these and give some examples of different business plans which are in the resource base and how they've tried to deal with them. So firstly, around financial analysis. Is, again, each of these, they're in the catalogue, was from an MPA in Albania, which determined the financial analysis in order to look at its long-term investment and operating costs. And from that, it was able to develop financial scenarios based on what it could achieve, what it would need in order to achieve its basic management operations, and what it would need in order to achieve its optimal management effectiveness. Costs over a 10-year period, which was done through the MedPan program, and they've got a financial planning tool on their website, which we give links to at the end. And that's a really useful template to help you work through the process of trying to determine what are your cost needs and how will it change over time. the tool also allows you to then program according to activities or focus areas. So determining how much you're spending on centralized administration versus maybe terrestrial or marine habitats. And that can help you also determine whether you're spending in the right areas or overspending in some. The second area is, as I mentioned before, often an area which is underutilized around cost reduction, cost sharing, partnerships and alliances. And then whether once you determine how much money you need, if you can reduce those needs by identifying opportunities for cost sharing, cost efficiencies, but also developing partnerships and particular alliances either between organizations in your country or with external organizations, which can reduce the overall need to then go out and find new financing options. And an example here is from a nature park in Slovenia, which went back through a series of options which they thought could help reduce their financial burdens around, could they look at volume purchases in the future where they could benefit through economies of scale, extending the useful lifespan of goods and equipment by implementing preventative maintenance rather than just dealing with things as they broke. Could they balance operations between balancing staff time in busy periods and low periods? And were there also opportunities to contract out services which maybe happened every quarter that they didn't necessarily need to keep all of the equipment, for example, in-house throughout the year? The third aspect that I want to show is around the financing plan. And there are many different ways in which you can develop your plans. Have simply just gone to the process of trying to identify a series of finance options that they can look at to generate their revenue. But it's also useful to take a step further, which an organization, which again, the Laughing Bird Key in Belize went a step further and started trying to place those options against a matrix of relative complexity against relative impact in order to help them prioritize which options they should pursue first and which ones they should leave till later. That's a useful way of determining if you're using your time most effectively. And whilst I show this slide, what I also wanted to do is just show that you can access.
Andrew, it seems that when you're changing slides or loading a page, your microphone is cut for some reason. So let's just wait for the page to load for a second and then, okay, does it work now? Yeah, perfect.
Thanks very much. Okay.
No, actually it's not working. We can see the page you're showing, we can see the resource, but we cannot hear you. I think it's an issue with the internet. So just to take over, Andrew is waiting for his microphone to be back. He's just showing you online pretty much the resource that he just presented in his webinar in the presentation, meaning that you can find online all the resources he's been talking about and will talk about. And there is over 70 resources uploaded on the NBSAP Forum under the tab of Search Resources. Sorry, Andrew, about that. Maybe it's better actually not to click on the link. And if you can leave a delay of 3 seconds when you change the slides, I think that will avoid any cut in your voice. Sorry about that.
No problem. Thank you for telling me. Otherwise, I'll happily talk away to myself. Okay, thank you. Then I've shown you how you can help prioritize using that simple matrix used by an example in Belize. Another option is, once you've developed what your prioritized options are, the future, you need to plan towards the future and how those financing streams will develop over time. But you won't know exactly what will happen because the variables can change. And so one way in which you can deal with this is by creating different scenarios where you change the variables and you give, for example, what could be the best case if all things work out and what could be the worst case. And that can also give you a range which can help determine or can help you decide whether you still go with that or with that particular financing option. And that can be quite an interesting way that you can also then help evaluate different financing options, but also different cost options, especially if you're going to do some sort of infrastructure development. You can try to determine if things went well or if things went badly, what would be the most effective option. And here you can see how this was used in Carimbas National Park in Mozambique, where they provided best case, medium and worst case options for collecting tourism revenues within its national park. And again, there's a link here at the bottom, but I won't click on that. So now that I've gone through that proposed structure and some of the examples, I wanted to give some practical implications of how this was used in Seychelles and how we found these resources useful and guided a business planning process. So hopefully you will also be able to see from your country point of view how you can apply this. Just some brief background is that my role in Seychelles is I'm the technical advisor to this Protected Area Finance project, which is a Government of Seychelles UNDP GEF project aiming to try and support the financial sustainability of the protected area system. And we're a 5-year project which started in 2016. The first step that we went through was to develop a national level finance plan for the whole protected area system. And within that, we followed the process of conducting an institutional and financial framework assessment for what options support existing financing options in Seychelles. We calculated the current finance needs and then tried to project the future financing needs based on 2 different scenarios. Firstly, to meet their basic management targets, and secondly, to meet their optimal management targets. We then went into a process of identifying options that could strengthen the cost effectiveness of the protected area system by identifying cross-subsidization, cost sharing between organizations, cost efficiencies, before going into evaluating which finance options could be used to meet those projected future needs. And then we developed a roadmap which effectively helped prioritize and map out how we would develop those options over a 5-year period. And that became a very useful tool for trying to decide what the vision was in the future and where we would get to and how all organizations fit into this overarching macro framework. So the next step is, before going into supporting individual organizations and PAs with their business planning, we conducted a national level business plan training for all protected areas, which is where these resources came into play. This wasn't just collected together by our project. We sent out a request to a number of organizations and professionals in the sector to help contribute resources. We collected together these 60 examples of business plans with the agreement that we would share them back out, which is what we're doing now through NBSAP Forum. And as you can see from the photos on your screen, we printed out a series of different types of business plans and got each protected area to go around and start to decide for themselves what aspects of other business plans were useful to them. What do they think made persuasive arguments? What was clear to them? And what kind of structure did they think was most appealing? And so from these 60 examples, we managed for each protected area to decide for them what was the most effective plan that they would have at the end. And we designed a process to try and achieve that vision of a plan. And we found that was quite useful because they started firstly engaging with business plans, but also critiquing the pros and cons of different plans and how, not whether they were good plans, but whether they were useful to their circumstance. And that is hopefully what can be offered to other people beyond this. National Parks Authority really wanted to develop their business plan or their strategic plan for their organization. And their specific objective was to try and use the plan to demonstrate their future ability to be able to manage their own financial future. And so they used the planning exercise as a way to try and prove that they were able to generate more revenue from conservation from their protected areas, and that they were currently underdeveloped options. They identified options to improve their cost efficiency and how they would put that in place, how they would be able to strengthen their ability to plan and utilize their revenues effectively by adjusting their organizational structure, putting a plan in place to build up the capacity of junior members through the system, as well as creating new business units within the organization, as well as how they could reinvest the retained revenue into infrastructure to improve the attractions for tourism businesses in the country. So they wanted to try and demonstrate how improving their financial future could also generate much greater multiplier effects for the local economy. And as a result, they were able to justify for a financial autonomy status, which was awarded at the start of this year. The information, not just as a business plan which is communicated to stakeholders, but mainly government and external donors, external financiers, but how could we get the wider Seychelles citizens to buy into the idea about investing in protected areas? And so we use the information to also start generating useful infographics to demonstrate how investing in protected areas created benefits for them, to justify that increased support. And these have been really useful tools that have been disseminated within every school in Seychelles. Is to properly try and introduce you to the available resources. So we have, from this business plan training in Seychelles, we have these 60 business plan examples, which include guidelines, as well as management plans from all continents, but it's also not a closed list. There are the opportunities for, if you as an organization have developed more business plans, we would welcome you to upload it onto the NBSAP Forum to grow this resource. And then hopefully we increase the amount of organizations which have business plans, and we start to close that financing gap, which has remained relatively stagnant. And so you can click by going onto the NBSAP Forum website. Under the knowledge base tab, you can go into search resources, and if you type in PA Business Plan Catalog, you will come up with the list of the 60 business plans, as well as if you want to use the financial planning tool, this can be found through MedPan, and I've given their link to the organization there. I won't click on the link just in case it is the system, but I know this will be PDF'd and sent around to everybody, so you will be able to access this. You'd like me to click the link?
Great. Thank you very much, Andrew. As you have understood, so Andrew is based in Seychelles, and we know that internet there can be challenging, so that's why you may have noticed a few delays in some slides. So apologies for that, but thank you so much, Andrew, for your time and for showing us a bit more, on business plan about protecting areas, and then being maybe ready to engage with our participants. We have over 100 participants right now online with us, and I do think you have some questions for him. So as I was telling at the beginning of this webinar, you can either manifest your interest in speaking by virtually raising your hand, or you can also type your question in the question bar, and then we can read that out loud. One more time, you can send your questions in English or French and Spanish if you are more comfortable speaking your native language. So back to participants, I see right now we have a few hand raised, and I'm going to give the priority to people who may be able to speak directly to Andrew. So I see Daniela is online and raising her hand. Daniela, I'm going to try to open your microphone. Can you hear us? Hi, Daniela, can you hear us? There seems to be a little issue with your microphone. We can hear background noise, but I cannot hear your voice. So maybe you can type your question and I'll read it out loud right after that. Thank you. I see there is also Demetrio. Demetrio, I'm going to try to open your microphone. Hopefully it's going to be working. Hi, Demetrio.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, you're cutting off a bit, but we can hear you. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. I would like to thank Andrew for the presentation as well. It was very good and very informative. And I have a question. I'm based in Equatorial Guinea, specifically in the city of Malabo. And I work for the UNDP, specifically for the Basin Sustainable Financing for protected areas. And there are about 6 countries that are part of that initiative, including Equatorial Guinea. And one of our goals this year, it's going to be putting together financial strategies for protected areas. So I would like to get advice about how to proceed from Andrew.
All right, Andrew, I don't know if you can reply to this one. I think you're on mute right now.
Yeah, I didn't, maybe I'm cutting out a lot. I didn't quite catch much of that, I'm afraid.
Yeah, so Demetrius, we could hear a bit your question, but understanding that you have 6 countries that you work with, including Papua New Guinea, and that you would like to move forward with some plans on protecting areas, and that you would need some advice from Andrew on how to do that from here.
Correct. That's right.
So you wanna plan for each of the 6 countries?
Well, it's 6 countries which are part of the Congo Basin, and Equatorial Guinea, not Papua New Guinea, is part of it. So each one of those countries is going to have to put together a protected area financing strategy. For instance, I'm from Equatorial Guinea, and there are 13 protected areas. However, the country lacks a financing strategy. So that's why one of our targets here is to develop that strategy for Equatorial Guinea. That's why I would like to have some advice from Andrew regarding how to proceed.
So Andrew,
Okay.
it's also, yeah, go for it. Go ahead if you do have elements of response.
Okay, well, thank you very much for your question. As given that sounds quite complex, if you have 6 countries to try and develop national level financing strategies for, if I didn't quite catch exactly which countries, but if they are all from the same region, then if it is practical, what is maybe the best first step is to have a group meeting. If you can bring national level stakeholders from each country together, maybe it is somebody from the Ministry of Environment, somebody from the Ministry of Finance and the protected area authorities together into a national level planning and training, at which point you can agree with them what should be the process for each of those countries. You may find that each country wants their own separate process, or they can agree upon a common process, and then you can help roll it out. It would also be a good way of the countries to get together at the start to share their experiences and their demands, because if there are commonalities between both the structure and the process as well as the outcome for them, you may find that this is a good way to build a network early on as you go through the business planning and implementation process. So that might be an effective way forward to begin with. And then you would obviously need to go into national level planning meetings with each country, where, I mean, obviously you need a wide stakeholder base, but what's critically important is to involve the Ministry of Finance or a Treasury Department or a President's Department at the onset, because given what we know about the level of the financing gaps within countries, you're not going to be talking about very little micro changes to the system. You'll need structural changes towards how environmental departments are financed. And so getting their buy-in at the Ministry of Finance level at the start and getting their buy-in to the process is really fundamental.
Great. Thank you very much, Andrew, for the element of response. And I hope that answered your question. We have a lot of questions coming to Andrew. One of them that we received a few minutes ago is it acceptable to prepare a business plan before a new protected area before the management plan? And that was from Radi Tofik.
That's a good question. So as I understand correctly, in this situation, there isn't a protected area developed, but they want to try and develop a business, wondering whether to develop a business plan before developing the management plan. Ideally, it would be best to develop the management plan first, because the management plan is really important to determine what you're going to try and do in the conservation, in the protected area. And so the management plan will have hopefully a 5 to 10 year costed implementation plan. And you would use that then as the basis for going into your business planning, because you need to know how much you're going to have to finance and what exactly you're going to finance. The management plan also will tell you what are going to be the allowable activities within the protected area. So you don't want to, for example, create a new business initiative around increasing tourism, for example, if it's a sensitive area and you're not going to allow tourism based on its IUCN category. So I would propose having a management plan first and then developing the business plan. But there was also a question of whether you can develop this before a protected area is created. And my answer to that would be yes. In fact, it would be a very important justification for creating a protected area, not just creating it and then trying to develop a plan later.
Thank you so much, Andrew, for the response. That was indeed an important question. We have another hand raised from Ye Ong. Ye, so I'm gonna open your microphone and see if you can hear us and you can speak. Can you hear us?
Yeah, yes, I'm here.
Hi, perfect. We can hear you. What's your question?
Yes, I'm from WCS Myanmar, and I'm working on Check 5 project and the sustainable mechanism. So I'm already have an experience in attending the training. This is given by Lucy. She's a consultant of the UNTP. So one question for me is, we are very clever and know in the protected area what we have, what are the resources. But for the financial session, so we are very so far. So my question is, which kind of people do you want to recommend to join in developing sustainable financing mechanism for the business plan? Yes, I already know we should assign the financing graduated people, but I think they are very far away from the concept of the protected area. So how would you like to recommend, which kind of step do we need to assign in developing the business plan?
So if I understood correctly, were you asking what type of people should you have developing the business plan? Is that correct?
Yes, yes.
Okay, so provisionally it would be best if either the protected area governing authority or the Ministry of Finance with the Ministry of Environment developed it themselves. That would be the key. But what you might want to do, depending on the complexity of your plan, is you might want to also start involving some external people that can give you some additional resources. For example, if you wanted to start looking at impact investment, for example, you might want to include an equity fund to give you some advice on what kind of options are financially feasible for your protected areas system. That would be an idea. You can, a lot of protected areas do bring in external consultants to develop a business plan, to develop a national level financing plan, which is fine, but ideally it would be done internally, where it's done through an internal stakeholder in the base in the country. What you might want to consider is bringing somebody in to just help with the process of just making sure that the process is a valid one that goes for peer review, and you get that wider sort of external party view on a plan. I'm not sure I properly answered your question there, but if you have a specific example, I can maybe respond to that.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Yi, for your question. Thanks, Andrew, for the answer. We have another question from Jeffrey Potent that says, the biggest challenge in our watershed PA is convincing the local economic development community that the PA makes business sense. Can you address this challenge? And that's something you've mentioned before.
How it makes business sense? Yes, it is a challenge. It's a growing challenge, especially when facing alternative economic opportunities like agriculture or construction. So what I was saying about determining what the impact of your protected area is on the local economy would be a really important step. So from a watershed management point of view, if there is a way in which you can do an ecosystem services valuation on the value of watershed management, on its flow levels, but also what is the opportunity cost to the local community of eroding that watershed. So what would be the business if you didn't support the watershed? What would be the business as usual scenario of degraded ecosystem services, and convert that to what would happen to, say, for example, water management in the local area. It might be, if you're in a coastal area, it might be flood prevention, for example. And so you can determine what would be the costs, and then determine what is being spent on the area at the moment, and how by increasing that money going into that watershed, how that would then improve the economic livelihoods in the local area. And that would be a useful way of converting your traditional ecosystem services valuation into monetary terms which are linked to people's livelihoods. So it's making that next step and how it impacts them, and it might be determining what the causal chains are.
Great, thank you so much. One more question again from Alberto. Alberto is raising his hand, so I'm gonna try to open your microphone. Hi, can you hear us and can you speak? Alberto? So I think your microphone is working, but I cannot hear your voice. Can you speak maybe louder? Yeah, unfortunately, I cannot hear your voice. I'm sorry. But I see you have also written your question. So I'm going to turn off your microphone and read your question instead for the sake of time. Sorry about this. But your question was, where can we secure a thorough guideline regarding writing bankable and fundable proposals for protected area business and benefits? Did you get this question, Andrew?
Where you can find a guideline for developing bankable business plans?
Bankable and fundable proposals, yeah, for protected area business and benefits plan.
Okay, so within the resource group there are a few examples of guidelines which help break it down step by step, how to develop a business plan. If you go on to that NOAA link for the webinar, that also provides a detailed step-by-step process, which I think also might help the question from I think it's from Equatorial Guinea. That would be one way, but additional resources, additional guidelines that have been developed, I would have to, I can have a look and come back to you on that. I know that the Coalition for Private Investment in Conservation are trying to, I think it is them that is developing templates for bankable projects for impact investment, for private investment. That maybe also be a useful resource. And I don't know also if the Biofin project or Nature for Development project within UNDP would also be developing those, but that would also be a good opportunity, I would think.
Great, thank you for the answer. I hope this answers your question. We also received a written question from Alexei that says, so good morning. The question would be, have there been alliances with private banks to prepare a business plan for protected areas? In case of yes, what kind of alliances is it? And how is it successful?
What sort of alliances have been conducted with private banks and whether they've been successful? Okay. So I know of partnerships that have been developed with private equity funds, or ones where they've been developed with private equity funds, where they have wanted to try and raise low-cost capital in order to develop tourism initiatives, for example, within a marine protected area. And they've used the business plan as that first step in the door, as a screening process for whether a private equity firm sees it as a viable business proposition. That would be one example, but it's starting to grow. They've also used these business plans as a way of getting grant funding from foundations, which have maybe done a mixture of loan and grant financing, for example, to try and have that blended capital approach. Going into specific examples is a bit difficult because often these business plans that are shared with either equity firms or with private banks are normally private because they're a business proposition. So hopefully more and more these will become available. I know of a few, but I'm not sure if I can mention them specifically.
Maybe those elements of response already answer, the question, and then, but then it brings also the attention on how important it is to involve the private sector in such financial plans. So thanks for the relevant question. And we also have another important question from Mahmoud, who's thanking you, Andrew, for this presentation. And the question is, what is your recommendation on how to communicate the business plans effectively with policymakers and other stakeholders? So this is more on communication again.
I lost you at the end.
Oh, sorry. So the question is, what's your recommendation on how to communicate the business plans effectively with the policymakers and the other stakeholders involved?
Okay, great question. The way in which I would probably approach that is, if you want to be able to communicate it effectively, know before you start what are the questions that the decision makers want answered. So meaning that if you're a government protected area and the Ministry of Finance holds the purse strings, find out what the Ministry of Finance wants to know. what are the kind of questions that they want answered. If it's your wider stakeholder base, for example, you want which maybe comes back to the question about watershed management in local communities. If you want to know how to create a business plan which is received, it's very useful finding out beforehand what the local community want, what questions they have, and you can directly tailor your business plan to try and address those questions. And so that's why maybe I'm a bit tentative over a guideline for developing a business plan, because as you'll see from the resource base, all business plans, they have commonalities, but they all take their own nuances, and those nuances are important. So that would probably be my main answers for communication, but also adding on that, finding different ways to communicate it, whether it's through creating infographics, so that you can communicate complicated messages in easy ways, or whether you get this information into schools so that you've got a wider stakeholder base of children advocating for supporting your protected area. Children often become very useful for convincing parents.
Indeed, they are. Thank you. And I'm just taking a few minutes here. We received a lot of questions for Andrew explaining how can I build my my business plan step by step. So Andrew has, through the webinar, showed how to do that on some aspects, but he also shared with you a link of a previous webinar he did that, you know, break down really specifically how to make a business plan. So because we will soon run out of time, I would recommend that maybe you watch first this video and this recording, and then if you still have some questions after that, then you can be in touch with Andrew directly. But this resource may be very interesting for you first. We have another question, Andrew, from Fernando. Fernando says, I would like to know what are the best indicators to communicate the benefits of protected area and finally break the paradigm between conventional rural development and nature conservation contributing to the local economies. So any indicators specifically, since we're on communication?
Okay, just off the top of my head, some of the most, I mean, the important thing to consider is what are the indicators that are most useful for the people that you're trying to convince. And so whether that is jobs, incomes, potentially volume of water during low or dry periods for agriculture, for example, mitigate, I guess, the opportunity cost of erosion, the volume of erosion for areas of land if you don't conserve the protected area. But also that return on investment is a really useful and simple way of communicating. There's some very nice studies which have started to come out through the NBSAP team, where they have been developing with Brazil, I think, did a tourism economic model for protected areas, where they determined what would be the direct and indirect benefits, economic benefits of tourism in a protected areas to local economies. And that was really nice, where it first showed that for every dollar invested, generated something like $3 or $4 directly, but if you multiplied that by the indirect benefits, it came out at sort of $20, $30, $40, and that's powerful stuff. So that would be my initial reaction.
Perfect. We will try to take one last question, unless, Andrew, you do have a bit of time to stay, maybe 10 more minutes to address a few more questions.
Yes, that's okay.
Great. We do receive a lot of interest from our participant. Daniela, we tried to open your microphone earlier. It didn't work. I'm going to give it a second chance and see if we can hear you now. Can you hear us? I don't think it's working. I'm really sorry. Let's see. Can you hear us? And can you speak? Yeah, I'm very sorry, Daniela. For some reason, we cannot hear you. So, but I see that you're trying to say something since the beginning. So I would encourage you to maybe write your question so I can read it to Andrew before we conclude this webinar. We have a few questions also from participants asking if the material will be available. Yes, we will share the presentation that Andrew has made in English, French, and Spanish. And we will also share the recording of this session with you. I'm just going to say in French, parce que Aboubacar, vous avez posé la même question en français. En français, oui, nous allons partager les présentations, notamment la présentation de Andrew sera traduite en français. Et nous partagerons également le webinaire en français avec vous. So do not worry, you will have access to this. Diego, we have a question in Spanish from Juliana, and it would be great if you can read this one out loud in English.
Yes, hold on, please. Juliana says, hold on.
Joyos. Starting with, en su experiencia.
Okay, in your experience, I'm sorry, I'm going to start reading. In your experience, what is the main source of incomes in a cost structure for a protected area? The income for tourism are enough for support the model, or effectively the government should assume some cost of functioning. Do you understand, Andrew, or do you want me to repeat it again?
Could you repeat it? I lost you in the middle there.
Okay. The question is, in your experience, what is the main source of incomes for a costing structure of a protected area? She's saying that the incomes from the tourism are enough to support the model, or if the government have to assume some of the cost of functioning of the protected areas.
Okay, I think it's important to, how would I say this? The way in which the conservation finance is going is they're trying to develop more and more innovative mechanisms for financing. But what really can't be lost is that the base level for protected area management should continue to be government funding for protected area management for a number of reasons. Namely that for some protected areas are too sensitive or too remote to be able to generate their own income. And some should absolutely not generate their own income and could have very dangerous consequences. The other one is that by providing that base level of income from the government, it then frees protected area agencies up to try and innovate and develop them. But if you reduce government funding, then protected area authorities will always work in a defensive manner. They will always go for the low-hanging fruit, which is not the idea. So in answer to that, I would say that yes, government budget should always provide that base level up until a point where either it covers the most sensitive protected areas, or it allows those protected areas to then go have the freedom to start looking for more revenue.
Thank you, Andrew. I'm going to translate now. So, para Andrew, es definitivamente importante que las áreas protegidas creen y desarrollen mecanismos innovadores para la financiación de sus áreas. Sin embargo, él considera que debería mantenerse o debería cultivarse la financiación desde el gobierno en cualquier caso. Principalmente porque algunas de las áreas protegidas dentro de los sistemas están en áreas remotas o no obtienen recursos económicos productos de ninguna actividad. Entonces siempre es necesario la financiación estatal, y lo que se buscaría entonces es que haya una línea, digamos, una financiación base desde el gobierno que permita apalancar recursos desde otras agencias y motivar la innovación. Entonces, básicamente la respuesta es sí, debería mantenerse la financiación gubernamental en las áreas protegidas y buscar otras alternativas adicionales a esa financiación. Thank you very much, Andrew.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, Diego, for translating. I'm going to take two last questions. So one, I'm going to try to open the microphone of Marcelo. who's been raising his hand for a long time. Marcelo, I'm not sure you can hear us. And if your microphone is working. No, unfortunately, Marcelo, we cannot hear you. So if you can quickly type your questions and I will read it for Andrew. In the meantime, Andrew, we also have a question from Teresa, who's thanking you first for this very interesting presentation. She's asking the following. In the slide concerning the financing of protected areas in Latin America, you mentioned some trust funds that I couldn't catch. One of them was a coalition. Can we have more information on those?
Sorry, could you just repeat the name of the trust fund?
Well, actually, you mentioned a trust fund, and one of them was a coalition.
Yes.
And she didn't catch very well what it was about, or what was this trust fund.
Okay, so the coalition for it's a coalition for private investment in conservation. It's a network, or it's not necessarily a trust fund. It's a network of a collection between development partners, but also private institutions like banks or equity funds that are trying to help identify what are the opportunities and the support that can be provided for protected areas through private impact investments. And that's a really nice growing area of work. But there are so it's not necessarily a trust fund, but the number of trust funds are growing. There is a very useful network, which name escapes me at the moment, of trust funds where they do I can try and find the study and send it to the particular participants about the growth of trust funds, but also where they are, how they're set up, and what they finance.
Great, thank you so much, Andrew. We are running out of time, and I'm just going to read you one last question that we received from Flavio, who's saying it's a more general, let's say, question. Andrew, congrats for your presentation. Do you believe that the business plan of the specific privately protected area is enough to sensitize the big companies to support conservation's initiative? Or do you believe that the big companies will act when the countries create laws to oblige them? My point is the mobilization of the resources for the implementation of the action to protect. It's a general question.
That's a big question. I don't think it's an either or. I think if governments create regulations which provide financial incentives for companies to invest, whether this is, and by investment I mean either as a donation through corporate social responsibility or invest as an impact investment with a financial return. I think countries can do a lot of work towards creating the right conditions and the right incentives, but the business plan is important as a way of getting a step in the door. It's a way of speaking the right language of a potential funder, rather than just saying, I have a protected area, it has value for a country, but also for the world and local livelihoods. Please finance us. So this is a way for you to be able to communicate in a business's language what can be developed, or what are the options within your protected area, and how that will change the conservation, the biodiversity conservation in that particular area. So I think it's a combination of both.
Perfect. Andrew, one last question, because this person was trying to speak on the microphone. It's Fanuel and Leia, and Fanuel is asking, what are the possible sources of funding for protected area business planning? And also I would like to know if there are any institutions readily available to help with capacity building. And that would be our last question for today.
Okay, I can So the first question is, what are the options? And the answer is a lot. The where you can find a list of those options is actually really useful. So if you're on the, if you go to the UNDP Biodiversity Finance Initiative webpage, they have a section under Finance Solutions where they give a breakdown of different types of finance solutions and then some examples within each of those. And that's a really useful resource which has come up over the last, I think it's the last year. And so you can start to use that as your way of breaking down whether different options apply to your particular circumstance. In terms of where you can get help from, I know that, again, the UNDP Biodiversity Finance Initiative do provide support to countries to develop biodiversity finance plans at a national level based on requests for support. There have been an increasing number of GEF, Global Environment Facility projects as well, like ours, where countries have requested a portion of their GEF star allocation to develop a protected area finance project. I also know that, for example, organizations like, hang on, I think IUCN also have a conservation finance facility or initiative where they also provide support to countries. And so there's a growing number of them. What I can maybe do is try and put together a bit of a list of different organizations and different resource links, which can then be circulated back to everybody, if that's useful.
Yeah, indeed, that would be fantastic. And thank you for this last answer, Andrew. And overall for this very informative webinar sessions. I'm sorry for the participants and the remaining questions. We're already 15 minutes past our time, but Andrew has kindly shared his email address on the presentation, meaning that you can reach him out directly with more specific questions. Indeed, the questions that we received, most of them were very specific. So I encourage you to be in touch directly with Andrew, who may provide more relevant feedback and advice for this one. With this, I would like to thank you all for attending this webinar and for your very active participation today. And as I mentioned at the beginning of this webinar and during the webinar, we will upload all the recordings and the presentation on the NBSAP Forum. Presentations will be translated, so of course in English, but also in French and Spanish. And we will share the recording and those presentations via email as well. So you will receive this in the next few days. Before we leave, I strongly encourage you to also look at all the resources from the Protected Area Business Plan catalogs on the NBSAP Forum, which is nbsapforum.net. And you search under the tab of searching resources, and you will find them all here, which may be very useful if you plan on developing your own plan sooner or later. With that, Andrew, would you like to say a few words before we conclude the webinar?
Just thank you to the NBSAP Forum, and thank you for really hosting these resources, because that was agreed with our project that we would share this information back. So I'm glad we've managed to do that, and also to everybody that's attended. I hope I've managed to answer some of your questions properly, but if you'd like to engage offline, I'm more than happy to try and search around for more materials, give you more advice as you go through any business planning processes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Thank you also, Diego, for all your support and the translation in Spanish. Thank you to all the participants. And with that, I wish you to have a great day or a good night, depending on where you are in the world, and hope to reconnect with you soon. Thank you very much. And this concludes our webinar.